Dawn slid across the limestone like a blade, turning the surf below Marpi Point into hammered pewter. Sergeant Eddie Tanaka, Nisei linguist with the Military Intelligence Service, climbed the coral steps with a bullhorn in his left hand and a white armband with a red cross on his sleeve. Behind him came PHM-2C Daniel Doc Murphy, U.S. Navy corpsman, boots salted from the night's spray, litter poles bouncing against his shoulder. The cave breathed out kerosene and mildew. Somewhere inside, a woman laboured because war has no regard for calendars. Tanaka cupped the bullhorn. "Civilians," he called in careful Tokyo school diction learned at his mother's table. "This is the United States military. We will not harm you. Food and doctors are ready at Camp Susupe." Murphy felt rather than saw the contraction tighten the dark. His bag held morphine syrettes, sulphur, clamps, a roll of gauze, the small absolutes that travel with a corpsman. He also carried a carbine he was determined not to need. The silence stretched until the surf sounded impatient. Then a square of cloth appeared, trembling. Not a flag, just the corner of a baby's blanket tied to a stick. A voice, dry as the cave, answered, "She is with child." Murphy and Tanaka eased forward, palms open. "We've got you," Murphy said, "because there are words you say even when no manual has taught you the vocabulary of this exact war." Below, a DUKW idled at the base of the steps, the amphibian truck's 6 wheels half in the tide, its snub bow facing the cave like a patient animal. They found the woman backed against limestone, lips white with pain, a husband at her shoulder, eyes braced for betrayal. She had been taught to fear Americans as monsters. She watched the corpsman's hands instead, and saw only work. They brought her out on the litter, the husband trailing, hands out as if ready to catch whatever happened next. The DUKW's bilge pump chattered. The driver backed and turned as gently as a 6x6 can on volcanic shelf, then nosed toward the sand road. The engine note deepened as it shifted from water to earth, amphibian becoming truck in the width of a tyre. A wash of surf licked the litter rails and carried away some of the blood. Tanaka climbed in beside the woman, started counting breaths in Japanese, the numbers like stepping stones over a river. They rode past burned cane, past Marines building a road with shovels and profanity, past a squad from the 27th Infantry Division moving prisoners with hands resting on rifle slings in a way that signalled both discipline and permission to breathe. The air smelled of salt, yesterday's cordite, and the clean bite of phenol from a newly opened medical crate. Under it, the convoy sound was the patient rhythm of bearings and belts. Camp Susupe rose out of. Sugar like a city pressed into being overnight, canvas streets squared by engineer stakes. A hand-lettered sign, maternity, flapped itself into existence with each breeze. A Navy nurse with salt-stiff hair checked the woman's pulse and spoke the international language of the wrist. "You're safe," Tanaka translated. "We will help the baby." The nurse's tray rattled with hemostats and a mercury thermometer, the glass column clacking against a basin's rim. Murphy felt the tense heat blur to a working weather. Steam, wet canvas, faint diesel from trucks that never seemed to stop arriving. It was not a miracle. It was a plan meeting a woman at the exact minute doctrine mattered. V Amphibious Corps had cracked the island, 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, 27th Infantry Division, and behind them the Civil Affairs Detachment carried clipboards like sidearms. Outside, a supply corporal chalked rations on a board. Inside, an OB checklist was pinned to the tent pole. When the contraction took her, the corpsman's hands remembered everything they had practiced on dummies and desperate men. Tanaka told her when to push. The nurse coached her breath. Somewhere a generator coughed, caught and steadied into a camp's heartbeat. The woman, her name would be written Nakamura Yumi on an intake card, bore down. The cave's smell fell away, replaced by carbolic and the human metallurgy of labour. The baby crowned, slick and undeniable. Murphy glanced at the nurse. The nurse nodded. The war kept happening. So did this. When the child came, she came small and furious, and the nurse cleared her mouth with a practiced swipe that belonged to no nation and all of them. The corpsman clamped and cut, the instruments chiming together like thin bells. Someone wrote a line in a ledger, the first of many that would trace a different front in the same campaign. Baby Nakamura, female, 0600, Susupe. They wrapped the newborn in a blanket that smelled faintly of machine oil and sun. Yumi turned her head and saw the nurse's mouth form the oldest instruction. Breathe. We've got you, Tanaka repeated, and this time she believed it because belief had been given physical weight. Outside, a kettle rattled for the second delivery. The surf boomed, the cliff exhaled, and the ledger page dated 12th July 1944 lay open to whatever the day would require. Outside the tent, an LVT-4 with its rear ramp down clattered past toward the beach, proof that the island's arteries ran both ways. The DUKW that had ferried them could carry 5,000 pounds or 24 souls at a time, and there were more where that came from. Thousands sent west by factories. Here the numbers became human. Camp Susupe would log 10 to 15 births a day, a tempo set not by rumour but by clipboards and hands that knew their work. Camp Susupe looked temporary the way a ship looks temporary at the dock, ready to move as soon as orders changed, yet complete as a world while it stayed. The canvas streets were lettered by hand, engineer stakes aligned like a parade. Yumi's thumb went into a pad of ink and came out with a violet oval that said she had entered a different kind of custody. A Navy nurse marked her chart with a neat block script, the pen warmed by a pocket. Murphy washed to the elbows at the sterilizer, letting hot air furl the damp cuffs of his dungaree shirt. The machine chattered and ticked. The basin's metal smell cut through the day. On a trestle table, clamps lay in a row like instruments in a narrow orchestra, hemostats, forceps, needle holder, each placed where muscle memory could find it at a reach and without a glance. A mercury thermometer clicked against tin, impatient for a decision. Tanaka translated not just words, but procedure, matching phrases to gestures so fear could become cooperation. Rations at noon and sundown, he told a line of women and children, pointing at a chalkboard already ghosted with yesterday's writing. Water is safe when the flag is green. Clinic hours are posted and will be kept. A DDT sprayer hissed down the breeze like a snake announcing a boundary. A hospital ship sat white and still on the horizon, too far to be useful to the eye, near enough to steady the heart. Murphy checked Yumi's breathing, then the fetal heart, that woodpecker rhythm small and determined. "You are not alone," he said, and Tanaka made the phrase into Japanese that carried warmth without condescension. The nurse asked about prior births, diet, fever, bleeding. Yumi answered without looking away from the tent's open flap, as if the whole island might retreat again and leave her with the cave. It would not. V Amphibious Corps had fought its way inland with 2nd and 4th Marines and the 27th Infantry Division. The fight's geometry had shifted from ridges and caves to clipboards, cook fires, watch bills, and the braided disciplines of sanitation and order. Camp Susupe's schedule, posted at dawn, read like a ship's plan of the day. Reveille by generator, water flag colours by hour, clinic hours, burial detail times when necessary, school tent to be opened when possible. "We will see 12 mothers by noon," Murphy said. "We will keep hands clean even if minds wander. We will not rush the part that cannot be rushed." With Tanaka translating, the words became law without sharp edges. The first delivery of the day set the tempo. Women in the line pressed hands to mouths and watched without speaking as the nurse gave the gentle commands that cross oceans. Breathe now, hold now. After, a clerk entered the name, time, weight, and a ration bump for the mother into a ledger whose pages were stiff from humidity. The tent breathed like a lung. One in, one out, one in. By noon, the chalkboard counted 3 births. By evening, it would count more. Time magazine would later report 10 to 15 births each day at the camp, numbers that sounded like rumour until you watched the kettle and the steriliser keep their own stubborn hours. Between labours, Murphy made rounds. At the ration line, a supply corporal weighed tins and handed out blankets with the nonchalance of someone who had finally been given enough to do his job right. He explained the system in a bored voice that disguised pride. Mothers first, elders next, children at every stop. Tanaka walked the perimeter with a PA truck in the afternoon. He read from a paper he had drafted himself, because truth was only useful if it could be quoted. He named camp amenities, latrine counts, clinic hours, and the existence of a school tent. At the end, he added a sentence not in any manual. I am Eddie Tanaka. I am the son of a grocer from Los Angeles. We keep our word toward dusk, a stillborn tested everyone's doctrine. The nurse wrapped the child, and the chaplain stood with the parents, while a detail cut a narrow trench in ground still holding the day's heat. The burial detail read a psalm and then a Shinto prayer learned the week before from a schoolteacher internee. Nothing in the equipment lists covered that. Everything in the camp's purpose demanded it. Evening brought a little breeze and the smell of rice from a field stove. Generators levelled into their night rhythm. A baby in the next tent worked through its first cry into something like a song. Murphy logged pulse rates and a ration bump for Yumi. She slept with the newborn tucked against her ribs where air and milk are always close. On the table the clamps cooled, and the tent accepted the dark as another thing to be handled by schedule. The hospital ship offshore, the white-hulled USS Solace AH-5, waited with operating rooms, X-ray and blood, a floating guarantee that complicated cases could be lifted out. Civil affairs doctrine put numbers to mercy. 1 latrine per 20, water points flagged for safety, chlorination checked by the watch. DDT sprayers stitched invisible fences against the mosquitoes that wars always enlist. Rumour said the Americans would rape and kill. The cave said to trust the rumour. The tent said otherwise, and the tent had a schedule. All afternoon Tanaka's loudspeaker truck idled along the cane fields and cliff roads, the horn bolted to the roof, shining like a silver challenge. He had rehearsed every syllable until meaning and cadence clicked like a bolt going home. Civilians, he broadcast in Japanese, the vowels bright and formal. Food today, blankets issued, clinic hours posted. Those who surrendered yesterday are alive at Camp Susupe. He read names of men and women who had come in, names verified at the ledger, proof against the theatre of lies. Sometimes he stopped the truck and let a woman already in the camp speak into the horn, her voice the most persuasive instrument the Allies owned. Yumi could not imagine the voice she would have offered the day before. Today she knew exactly what to say if asked. There is milk for babies, the doctors are stern but kind, and no one touches you without asking first. She slept between feedings and woke to the rattle of the sterilizer and the bass note of generators. She held her daughter under a blanket that smelled faintly of oil and new canvas and watched the intake line ebb and fill. At evening, a chaplain came with a small book and a smaller smile, saying little, listening more, making space for prayers that did not match his own. Murphy walked the aisle with a pencil tucked behind his ear and the day's log in his hands, checking pulse, temp, mood. He would have admitted he preferred the order of lists to the chaos of fear. Under the canvas you could control variables. On the beach the variables controlled you. One woman, older, asked through Tanaka whether the Japanese army would punish them all for surrendering. Tanaka answered with precision. The only punishments here were for lice and for skipping hand-washing, and both were cured by soap. The nurse kept the ledger smooth with a blotter, names, times, weights, a tally of births that grew by the hour. By the end of the week, the log would show 10 to 15 births per day. a number that would have sounded like propaganda if it hadn't been written in the same hand that recorded rations and vaccine lots. Saito watched from the scrub with field glasses trembling on his brow. The enemy's mercy unnerved him more than its fire. He had learned to accept naval guns as a weather pattern. What he could not accept yet was the way the Americans ran their mercy like a factory. Convoys of DUKWs and trucks moved on time. LVT-4S came and went, ramps down, cargo shifted by silent hand signals. A corpsman trotted a baby out to a waiting vehicle held level as an altar. Every act seemed rehearsed into muscle. He took out his notebook and wrote a sentence that he crossed out, and wrote again because the words felt like betrayal. They shoot as if ammunition were rain, and still they save babies. At night, the camp made a sound like a ship at sea. Murphy lay in a cot he had stolen from a collapsed tent and let fatigue settle him into bone. He thought about the numbers he could see and the ones he could not. In the Marianas, just beyond the horizon of this canvas town, a white-hulled hospital ship could take surgical cases. Beyond that, stateside, an arsenal of factories produced supplies with an indifference to difficulty that looked like benevolence from here. The American machine had room for mercy because it had room for everything. In 1944 alone, American factories built roughly 96,000 aircraft, a figure so large it threatened to become abstract until you tried to imagine the crates, engines, wings and rivets feeding down the rails. Japan, crushed by blockade and bombardment, would struggle to produce even a third of that in a year. What happened in the maternity tent was not separate from that arithmetic. It was an expression of it. Yumi did not know the numbers and would not have cared, but she felt their shadow in the way blankets were stacked, in the fact that the second pot of rice never ran out before the third pot was ready. She felt it in the nurse's ability to insist on rest because there were enough hands to make the insistence possible. Toward midnight, the tent quieted into a slow tide. The chaplain's flashlight moved once more past the cots and stopped at the empty bassinet that should have been occupied but wasn't. Earlier, a stillborn child had come and gone, and the burial detail had done its work with a tenderness that surprised no one anymore. Murphy sat for a minute there, writing nothing, just letting absence weigh what it always weighs. "Doc," the nurse said softly, and he nodded and stood and kept moving. Outside, the PA truck came in from another round of the cliffs with its horn cover beaded by dew. Tanaka climbed down and stretched and went straight to the ledger to add the names he had promised on the road. Proof entered in ink. Word would ride those names back into caves and across fields and into planning rooms where officers had ordered death and would now have to explain why. If the enemy were animals, the animals ran clinics and printed schedules. By morning, the sky over Susupe would grow pale, and the camp would wake to its list. The generators would cough and catch. The water flag would shift to green. Women who had never met would pass one blanket to another child without anyone telling them to. Another convoy would come up from the beach, and another white rag on a stick would wave from rock to road because reputation, once it starts moving, has a momentum as practical as any wheel. By the second week, the camp ran on a rhythm that felt as intentional as a convoy schedule. A chalkboard hung on the maternity pole, smudged by hands and drizzle. Intake 0700, clinic 0800 to 1200, rest 1200 to 1400, clinic 1400 to 1800, lights 1900. Murphy stood under it and briefed his team the way a coxswain briefs a boat crew. Short, crisp, with no one mistaking kindness for slack. Tanaka pinned a card beside the schedule that translated each block into Japanese in lines straight as drill yard chalk. The nurse warmed instruments at the sterilizer, a dry heat oven whose timer clicked steadily towards safe. Everything smelled of canvas, damp wood, and the sharp, clean bite of carbolic. A kettle pumped steam like a locomotive in miniature. Outside, an engineer section set another row of tents at measured intervals. Guy ropes plucked tight like bowstrings so canvas would not drum itself to pieces in the trade wind. The camp lived because it was engineered to live. Across the beach road, the ocean lifted and set as if nodding approval. From the bluff, you could see LVT-4s nosing in with their rear ramps down, offloading crates marked MILK, EVAP, and bundles of blankets. POWs made their hoses of wake toward the sand, crawled out, and became trucks in a breath. Their specifications: 6x6 drive, 5,000-pound payload, about 24 passengers, were less important than the truth they represented: capacity on demand. Capacity meant you could be humane without hesitation because you were not choosing between mercy and fire, only between doing both smoothly or badly. Mid-morning, a messenger brought a note. One case needs lift to ship. Murphy read it and folded it once, already imagining the white hull of USS Solace AH-5 rising beyond the reefs like a promise with a funnel. Solace carried operating rooms, X-ray, blood, and Navy nurses whose competence had the comfortable weight of ritual. The evacuation drill was a choreography practiced until the awkward edges had worn off. Litter to DUKW, DUKW to lighter, or directly alongside if the sea behaved, transfer to Solace's receiving station. You could draw it with a pencil and trust it with a life. Inside the tent, births kept time with the sterilizer's tick. Murphy and the nurse caught a breach by instinct and muscle, turning the infant with that respectful firmness the manuals call gentle traction. The ledger recorded the weight and time. The ration clerk added a note. Maternity bump issued. The chaplain passed by with a nod and a cup of weak coffee that might as well have been sacramental. Yumi slept and woke and fed and slept, moving through the simple arithmetic of milk. And hours. She watched the nurse teach another mother how to swaddle, the movement so automatic it resembled a weapons drill, hands and cloth and wrap, then tuck. She watched Tanaka assemble a dozen women by the rope line and explain hand-washing with a bar of soap and a bucket as if explaining a field radio. Step 1, Step 2, check function. In the afternoon, the PA truck went out again, this time carrying 2 women who volunteered to speak. They sat on the tailgate with their knees together and their hands in their laps and told the truth in voices that were not brave so much as practical. "Susupe has doctors," one said. "They delivered my child. My husband is alive." A man in the scrub shouted liar and threw a stone that fell short. The second woman bowed in the direction of the voice and said, "I will keep repeating myself until you are tired of hearing it." If there was doctrine in that, it aligned perfectly with the Civil Affairs Manual. Accurate promises, delivered repeatedly, verified in public, became weapons sharper than shrapnel. Toward evening, clouds piled up from the east and broke into a soft rain that glossed the guy ropes and darkened the canvas to the colour of wet slate. Inside, the tent glowed like a lantern. Murphy counted instruments intact, checked needles, labelled morphine syrettes for the night. The nurse logged vaccine lot numbers. Tanaka sat at the end of the trestle table and wrote names in both scripts until his hand cramped. Under all that administration lay the heartbeat that would not be denied. 10, 12, 14 new lives in a day. When the camp slept, it slept the way ships sleep, by watches. Murphy took his turn at midnight, pulling the blanket to his chin against the damp. From the beach came engine noise and the cough of a generator seizing then catching. He thought about how this looked from the air, a geometry of tents and patrol paths, a grid that meant order had been force-fed into chaos. And he thought about how it looked from a mile offshore. A small, specific victory visible as a rectangle of light and a line of footprints between canvas and sea. Sometime near dawn, a cry that was not pain but triumph cut through the fabric and called everyone briefly awake. It faded to a newborn's soft wheeze and then to a set of careful breaths counted in Japanese and English. 1, 2, 3, ichi, ni, san. By first light, the chalkboard would be wiped and written again, the schedule as stubborn as the tide, and a white-hulled ship would still be out there, unblinking as a fact that did not need to raise its voice to be believed. The sea kept its own counsel while the camp kept time. Saito Kenji had once loved the precise language of artillery maps, contour lines like fingerprints, grid squares that promised certainty in a world that resisted it. Now he lay in scrub near the camp perimeter with a pair of field glasses and a notebook that had become a confessional. The wind smelled of salt and wet grass. The ground carried a tremor that was not fear but machinery. Through the grasses he watched a thing his doctrine had not prepared him for, a machine that fed mercy on a schedule. At dawn, a DUKW crawled out of the surf and became a truck in the width of a tire, 6x6 gears taking hold like a climber finding purchase. Men in faded utilities, boots white from salt, moved crates stamped milk, evap, and sacks of something he guessed must be rice into a tent city that seemed to grow at its edges while he blinked. A clerk took notes on a board and held up his palm for a count that matched the notebook at his belt. Nothing here was casual. The LVT-4S returned as the tide turned, rear ramps down, and a chain of hands walked bundles of blankets off their steel backs as if they were shells to be fused and not cloth to be warmed. Saito noted intervals and tried to make them mean weakness. They did not. The convoys kept their time across the hours like prayer. From the road above the beach, he watched the white hull of a hospital ship steady in the swell beyond the reefs. He had seen hospital ships before, but never one standing so near a battle and keeping its promise intact. He wrote its name phonetically in his notebook because the Roman letters swam when his heart beat too fast. On the second line he wrote a sentence and crossed it out because it felt like surrender. They have built a harbour of kindness and stocked it with rules. Closer, within earshot of the tent flaps, he heard the American with the Japanese voice speak through a horn, telling truths that were verifiable by walking 10 steps. Saito watched 2 women speak from the back of the truck, their hands in their laps, the timbre of their voices practical as tools. Children he could not count watched from the cane and did what children always do when adults pretend the world is simple. They compared facts. Inside the tent, a cry rose, and then the thinner complaints of a child not yet committed to liking air. The first time he had heard that sound, he had thought of ambush. Now he thought of arithmetic. If the camp could deliver 10 births in a day, then the camp had solved problems that his army could not solve for its own. He remembered a captain saying that the Americans were soft and that softness was weakness. He put his pencil on that belief and pushed until it splintered. He had learned to respect American fire already. On the ridge days before, he had watched naval gunfire march from left to right, with an indifference to obstacles that felt personal. But the cargoes of mercy landing with the same precision as the shells, they bothered him more deeply. What creed could answer a nation that expended ammunition like rain and still had the strength and will to spare blankets, milk, doctors, schedules? At midday he saw the little procession that proved the system's reach, a litter carried level by 2 corpsmen who moved at that careful trot you learn when you have done it too often. They slid the patient into a DUKW, covered her against spray, checked straps, and signalled forward. The driver gave the amphibian just enough throttle to ease into the cutter-slashed water without slapping, then kept the bow square to the swell until he could angle toward the ship. Saito's pencil made hash marks on the margin for the minutes between shore and rendezvous. He tried not to imagine the inside of that white hull where the light would be clean and the floors waxed and the hands sure. By late afternoon he had eaten the last of his rice, measured by 3 mouthfuls, and then 4 sips of water. He emptied sand from his boot and considered the calculus of surrender without yet naming it. In the evening the PA truck returned and parked near the wire, and the interpreter read names of people who had entered the camp and had not been harmed. He listed the day's clinic hours again, and the words sounded like a tide chart. Saito pressed his face into the crook of his arm and tried to be made of stone. Somewhere behind him, a man who had been his sergeant whispered that capture meant dishonour and that a good death was better. Saito thought of the child he had once held under a cotton mosquito net while rain banged the roof drum hard, and how the child had slept because the world outside was bounded by kindness and rule. He listened to the camp run on time while the ridge guns coughed the night farther inland. Near midnight he wrote the sentence again and did not cross it out this time. They shoot as if ammunition were rain, and still they save babies. He was surprised to discover that writing the words did not kill him. Just before dawn, a chill ran under the canvas city and made the lantern light fragile. The generators coughed, caught and levelled. The schedule would wake and walk. Saito put the glasses away and crawled back into the brush, one more shadow among thousands, but the shape of his thoughts had changed in ways he could not yet defend, even to himself. In the distance, an LVT's track clattered over coral like a gear turning in air, and he understood that this too was part of an engine he could not stop with a rifle or a sentence. The sun began to argue the case all over again, and the camp stood up ready to make its reply in milk rations and clinic cards and hands that did not shake. The camp's mercy was not an accident or a mood, it was doctrine wearing boots. The civil affairs captain briefed his section with a pointer on a grease pencil map, the lines drawn across sugar fields and roads like arteries. Disarm, segregate, stabilise, prevent disease, restore order. Those verbs were not sentimental, they were operational, as necessary to holding ground as wire and mines. He walked the tent rows with a checklist in a clipboard's steel jaw and counted what doctrine always counts: latrines per head, water points and chlorination, waste pits downwind, clinic hours posted and kept, rations by weight not wish. The ledger began to look less like a diary and more like a ship's log, each entry a bearing to steer by. Tanaka moved between camp and cliff with the PA truck and the same deliberate courtesy he would have used at his father's grocery. He did not oversell. He gave times and locations the way a map gives distances, without drama, exact enough to be useful. When the loudspeaker said the clinic opened at 8, the nurse opened the tent flap at 8. When it said mothers were seen first, mothers went first. Repetition built a bridge strong enough for fear to cross. Murphy found himself quoting the checklist to his own hands. Wash, glove, instrument count, swab, breathe. Between births, he read the chart of vaccine lot numbers as carefully as he had once read a casualty report, because both were life and neither could be guessed at. The nurse put a strip of tape on the sterilizer and wrote the hour in pencil, because the pencil did not run in humidity the way ink will. Outside, an engineer squad cut shallow ditches around each tent to teach the rain where to go. Seabees in a truck the colour of dry mud dropped plank walkways across the worst of the muck so stretchers would ride level and boots would not shear through clay to the ankle. From the bluff you could see, beyond this grid of canvas and discipline, the faint activity on the new airstrip, where men with shovels and graders drew an argument across coral that would end far from here. The argument was simple. If civilians were fed and kept clean, the rear stayed quiet. If the rear stayed quiet, the airfield came online faster. If the airfield came online faster, the war shortened by days that counted as lives. The doctrine did not say this out loud, but everyone in the chain felt the truth. The impossible numbers that frightened Saito were written into other ledgers as well. In the Central Pacific, and then at Okinawa, American units would fire artillery at rates that defied belief. 10th Army's 105mm howitzers alone would send roughly 1.1 million rounds into the hills and ridges of that island in less than 3 months. That statistic belonged to a different, map square than this tent, but it was kin to the metrics that governed Susupe. Rations issued, births recorded, latrines dug, water flags set to green. Only a system that could feed ammunition by the million could also feed mercy by the 100 without blinking. Near sunset, the captain posted a notice board by the gate. It listed clinic hours, ration distribution by block, sanitation rules, and the school tent's opening date. A young internee who had been a teacher in Kagoshima took the chalk and copied the Japanese text beneath with the neat authority of someone reclaiming a vocation. She asked whether she could organize a reading circle for children after sundown. Doctrinally, the captain should have said no. Instead, he said, "Keep the volume down after 1900, and wrote her name under volunteer. Later, a dispute at the water point brought the lesson back to the ledger. Two men argued over can placement, and the noise lifted higher than it should have. Murphy stepped between them with the effortless authority of a man who has carried heavier things than pride. He pointed to the schedule and to the flag that marked the hour's safety, and then to the children waiting behind. The men nodded, embarrassed in that peculiar way adults are when reminded that the rules were made in their favour. That night, a squall found a seam in the canvas and put a thin pelt of rain over everything. Tanaka walked the rows with a lantern, checking for leaks and for women who needed a blanket shaken dry and retucked. When he reached Yumi's cot, the baby had angled herself across her mother like a sash. He adjusted the blanket and left a square of chocolate from a K ration, an extravagance that in another place and time would have meant nothing, and here meant a doctrine you could taste. From offshore, Solace's white hull showed as a smudge under cloud, a quiet proof that the evacuation chain held even at night. Down at the road, a DUKW's engine made the friendly agricultural sound of a machine designed to work and work and work. At the edge of the camp, Saito lay without sleeping and tried to square his orders with what his eyes had counted. He could dismiss kindness as a tactic. He could not dismiss a schedule that never failed. He could hate the enemy's fire. He could not help admiring its logistics. Toward morning, the generator caught after 2 tries, coughing into a steady hum that sounded, once you had lived by it, almost like a lullaby. The captain sharpened his pencil and set his clipboard on the gate table. The nurse warmed the sterilizer. Murphy washed to the elbows. Somewhere up the road, an engine turned over and a PA horn cleared its throat to tell the truth again and again and again until belief had nothing left to argue with. The sky broke and kept breaking. A grey ocean poured upside down. Canvas snapped, ropes thrummed, and the road to the new gate pooled into brown mirrors stamped with boot prints and hope. The hand-painted board read, "Ishikawa Reception." Beneath it, a second line in careful Japanese repeated the same promise in strokes steady enough to believe. Murphy stepped off the weapons carrier with his canvas kit, a sheaf of orders stamped 10th Army, and a face already salted white. "This isn't Saipan," the civil affairs captain said, pencil tapping a grease map where names, Ishikawa, Koza, Shimabuku, Awase, were boxed like objectives. "It's that. Times 10. Mothers first. Disease is the real enemy behind the line." The rain made a steady argument against electricity. Generators coughed as water climbed their housings. Seabees levered them onto pallet cribbing, slinging cable the colour of wet snakes. Engineers carved ditches around tents. The trenches filled, spilled, then, after an hour of cursing and shovel ballet, finally obeyed gravity and led the brown water downwind. The nurse walked the intake row with one hand on a forearm, eyes on eyes. You don't need grammar to reassure a mother holding a swaddled future. A DUKW came shouldering out of a ditch like a tired ox, 6-wheel drive biting through muck, its bed stacked with crates stamped milk, evap, sacks of rice, rolls of canvas, a box of morphine syrettes, and a sulphur case whose depot stencil testified to a journey across half the world. An LVT-4 clattered past with its rear ramp down, treads punching crescents into the flooded road as it ferried blankets toward a tent whose guy lines thrummed like harp strings. Inside the clinic fly, Murphy set a dry heat sterilizer on a trestle and listened to its timer tick an argument against the storm. The nurse unrolled instruments, hemostats, forceps, needle holder, laying each in a place muscle memory could find without looking. Sergeant Eddie Tanaka, slicker, shiny with failure, checked a microphone and nodded toward the hills. "Names first," he said, "then facts." He knew the route his PA truck would run, the caves and scrapes where civilians waited for a rumour to be disproved. "We have to be more reliable than weather." Before lunch, the captain called a number that steadied spines. 13 mothers through by noon, generator or lantern, no excuses. Then he read the expectation from headquarters. By late June, approximately 196,000 civilians would be under military government control island-wide if these camps held. The figure felt mythic, and yet the rain made it intimate. One mother, one stretcher, one clinic card at a time. Tanaka's voice went out into stone and bamboo, naming camp hours, safe routes, the location of the school tent at Awas, with the same patience you use coaxing a skittish animal. 2 women who had delivered at Camp Susupe months before rode the tailgate, wet hair pinned back, voices practical as tools, clean water, real doctors, blankets, food. In the fly, the sterilizer faltered, caught and held. The first Okinawa child that day announced herself with a thin, furious ribbon of sound that cut the rain's fist and drew a cheer from strangers who would likely never learn her name. Murphy logged the hour and weight, added the ration bump, and felt something old lift off his shoulders that bullets had not removed. Afternoon brought the rain's second. Act, harder now, confident. CBs cribbed the generator higher. Engineers planked the sucking places so litters would ride level. A DDT sprayer hissed at the canvas edge, stitching an invisible fence against the mosquitoes that conscript any army foolish enough to forget them. The ledger accepted its first Okinawa pages, paper softening at the corners but holding ink like a vow. At dusk the road shone black and the hills spoke in guns. Tanaka came back with the horn quiet and the microphone cold, lips blue at the edges, and wrote 36 names he had promised on the road, proof entered in 2 scripts. The captain stood in the entrance and let the water bead his cap brim. "We'll do this tomorrow," he said, and then, as if saying it were a binding order, "and the day after." The rain obeyed no one, but the camp behaved as if it had heard and agreed. By midnight, the generator note levelled into a lullaby, the sterilizer ticked like a metronome, and a lantern hissed above a sleeping mother whose world had narrowed to breath, milk, and a blanket that smelled faintly of machine oil and clean canvas. Industrial mercy, warm against the skin. They parked the pallets under the same revetment. 105mm HE shells on one side, tinned milk on the other, 2 columns of American intent waiting for trucks that arrived by the clock. To a newcomer the pairing felt obscene, death and formula sharing shade. To Murphy it looked like the only honest sentence the island could speak. The arsenal fed both fronts. Up the road, a battery chief checked fuses with a wrist turn that said long practice. Down the slope, a nurse warmed a bottle in a canteen cup and watched a child's jaw remember how to live. The 10th Army fought a meat grinder campaign to the south. The rear echelons built, fed, inoculated. Even as the front consumed steel, the camps kept clinic hours like a chapel keeps vespers. Tanaka rode shotgun in the PA truck, horn bolted to the roof like a lighthouse. He named Ishikawa and Koza, pointed toward Shimabuku, assured the doubtful that Awasi's school tent had dry mats, and, because truth works best with details, gave the exact time mothers would be seen. 8 sharp, no waiting outside the rope. He learned to let witnesses speak first. A woman with a newborn under her blouse told a cliff full of strangers that the doctor had been stern, the water boiled, the blankets counted, and no one touched her without asking. Facts landed like seeds, belief sprouted late but strong. Saito, now a prisoner in a canvas pen that smelled of damp rope and boiled rice, watched the convoys through the wire and read American time by axle and tread. The DUKWs nosed out of surf, shrugged off water and became trucks as soon as their tyres found grip. LVT-4s clattered to a halt and dropped their ramps with the clean motion of a habit finished to smoothness. He wrote in his notebook because naming a thing made it bearable. The enemy had built a harbour of kindness and stocked it with rules. To his right, a corpsman trotted a baby to a waiting litter, held level as an altar. To his left, a column of ammunition trucks rolled past with the indifference of rain. The paradox refused to be paradox. The same system that moved shells by the million also moved blankets by the thousand, because it could. The numbers were not rumour. On the gun line, the 105mm howitzers fired at a pace that felt impossible. And yet was ordinary. By campaign's end, more than 1.1 million 105mm rounds would smash the ridges of this island. In the camps, the clinic logs ticked forward steadily. Names, dates, weights, modest numbers against the battle's thundering tally, and yet decisive in a quieter ledger. Yumi, hair pinned up against the heat, learned the new camp's map by walking it with Sachi on her hip. Water point, latrine, ration line, clinic fly, and a school tent where a young woman from Kagoshima taught children to sound out kana with a piece of charcoal. She passed the revetment twice daily and never once looked away from the stack of shells. She did not hate them. The shells were a weather system that had blown fear off the island and made room for her daughter's lungs. In the afternoon, a generator failed and the camp folded open like a pocket knife. Lanterns hissed to life. The sterilizer rode the last of its heat. The nurse counted by touch instead of dial. Murphy caught a breach by the manual and by faith and came away shaking with delayed fear and simple pride. The Seabees rerouted power with a coil of cable and a habit of refusing to be surprised. After dark, the rain came back and sat on the tent tops like a man who had paid for his seat. Tanaka returned from the cliffs with 3 more names for the ledger and a stone bruise on his shoulder where someone still, stubbornly, had thrown a last refusal. He smiled without humour. "They'll tire before I do," he said, and cleaned the microphone head with a scrap of gauze as if tending a rifle. From offshore, the white hull of a hospital ship showed itself in the streaks of lightning. USS Solace AH-5, steady under the weather, a floating definition of reassurance. In the pen, Saito closed his notebook, lay back on the boards, and listened to a baby fuss itself towards sleep in a language older than uniforms. He understood, finally, that abundance crushes as surely as artillery, and that mercy, when it runs on time, demoralizes faster than hunger. The night smelled of wet wool and machine oil and boiled milk, and the camp kept its appointment with the morning. The generator died like a man who had already warned you twice. 1 cough, 1 stagger, silence. The rain pressed close, heavy as a hand, and the tent air cooled to a damp that made breath visible. The nurse did not look up. She said, "Lantern," and a corpsman twisted the valve on a coalman until the mantles bloomed with a steady hiss that sounded like resolve. "We keep the schedule," Murphy said, because saying it aloud arms the hands. A mother laboured under canvas that snapped and sagged. Thunder walked a ridge away and pretended to be artillery. Tanaka stepped in with his slicker dripping and read the room the way he read a crowd, fast, respectfully, choosing the one face that needed a promise most. "We have you," he said in Japanese, voice pitched low, rhythm like rocking. Outside, Seabees in soaked dungarees levered the generator onto higher cribbing and chased a ground that had wandered. Engineers dropped plank paths across the sucking mud so stretchers would ride level. A DDT sprayer stitched its quiet fence, bitter powder in the air. Inside, Murphy worked the kit, hemostats in a neat row, sutures laid out, morphine syrettes taped so he could count by feel. The lantern light made the instruments glow like fireflies, pretty and clinical. "Breach," the nurse said, and every shoulder squared itself a little higher. Training carries you to the threshold, experience walks you through. Murphy followed the manual he had learned by heart and the judgment he had earned by blood, turning gently, traction timed to breath, one hand steady on the flank of a child he had not met and already knew. The camp's noise fell back as if listening. The baby came angry and small and wet, and the nurse cleared her airway with a motion shared by 1,000 women in 1,000 tents and wards. The cry cut through weather, and the tent exhaled. "Mark the time," the nurse said, and the clerk wrote it with a pencil that did not bleed. 2307. Lantern births became a ritual, not a contingency. They trained a second crew on the lamp and a third on counting seconds against the sterilizer's fading heat. They wrote down what had worked and what had embarrassed them, a habit as old as sail and as modern as doctrine. When the generator finally coughed back to life, the crew did not cheer. They nodded because the lamp had proved it would carry them whether the engine did or not. In the pen beyond the rope, Saito watched the tent glow like a ship's window and felt a memory rise of his son sleeping under a cotton net while a typhoon hammered home. He pressed his palm to the wire and did not know what prayer he was making. After midnight, the camp shifted to the soft labour of keeping promises. Tanaka went back out with the PA truck, its horn hooded, a low-volume loop only the nearest caves could hear. He named clinic hours again, and then, because truth multiplies when repeated, he named them once more, adding the fact that 3 mothers had delivered tonight by lantern and that all 3 babies were swaddled and asleep. He named the witnesses. He invited the listeners to become them. The driver rolled slow, headlights hooded, engine a steady murmur that set the mud to gentle boil. At dawn the rain grudgingly thinned. The ledger accepted the night's names, and the ration line moved with that quiet intention that happens when people have eaten enough days in a row to pace themselves. The nurse made a new list. Lamp mantles to be replaced, spare wicks, 2 tins of white gas, a rubber apron whose seam had failed, a promise to teach basic obstetrics to any CB who wanted to learn because sometimes the nearest steady pair of hands wore a construction battalion patch. Murphy wrote up the breach while it was still warm in his head, drawing a little sketch in the margin that would have embarrassed him on a different day. He glanced toward the revetment where shells and milk shared shade and decided the pairing would never stop feeling like a sentence that should not pass and somehow did. A runner came from the airfield with a note. The strip would open one section early if the rear stayed quiet through the week. The arithmetic clicked. Clinics mean order. Order means concrete. Concrete means sorties. Sorties mean fewer men killed storming hills that could be strafed flat. Impossible numbers rippled through ordinary gestures. One army firing over 1,105mm rounds, while also keeping clinic appointments by lantern during a monsoon. The morning formed itself out of steam and patience. The nurse poured coffee as if it were sacrament. Sachi woke, indignant at daylight, and Yumi laughed the flat laugh of the tired blessed. The lantern hissed out, its work done for now, and the generator carried the hum into the next set of promises. The historian's sin is to make awe into abstraction. Numbers cool fast on the page. So begin again with steel in a hand, a corpsman's clamp catching an umbilical cord, a ration clerk's scale settling at 1 pound of rice and 2 tins per nursing mother, a CB's crowbar levering a generator 1 inch at a time. Now zoom out until tents become pins on a map, then farther until islands are waypoints and the ocean is a supply route. In 1944, American plants built roughly 96,000 aircraft. A figure that strains credulity until you imagine crates and engines, wings and rivets, and the rail cars and trucks that ferried them. Wartime totals would approach 296,000. Japanese production, hamstrung by blockade and bombardment, would not touch that horizon. The same industrial pulse that made aviation a flood made the Pacific a lattice of logistics. 21,147 DUKWs rolled off lines, and more than 8,000 LVT-4s joined their tracked cousins, enough hulls that on any given day a camp could expect more vehicles, not fewer, after losses. Such margin does not merely allow mercy, it makes mercy cheap, the way a millionaire buying bread is not benevolent but barely inconvenienced. The ledger of shells dwarfed all else. The The 10th Army fed its guns at rates that turned adjectives into trivia. Over 1.1,105mm rounds by the end of Okinawa, plus every other caliber from 75 to 155, plus naval gunfire that wrote its own literature on the southern hills. Here is the conversion the ledger rarely states. Fire at that scale buys time, time buys order, order buys clinic hours buy belief, belief buys surrender, surrender saves lives and accelerates the opening of airfields that strangle wars. In Ishikawa, the chalkboard schedule, intake 0700, clinic 0800, rest 1200, clinic 1400, looked like housekeeping. In Naha, the runway lengthening by the hour looked like heroics. They were the same act seen from different altitudes. Quartermasters put the logic to paper because that is how democracies prove things to themselves. 5 gallons of gasoline here yields 1 lantern kept, which yields 3 mothers seen after dark, which yields 30 fewer holdouts to be flushed from caves at dawn, which yields 4 bulldozers running uninterrupted, which yields 40 yards of graded strip, which yields 1 more B-29 ready day. Saito, in the pen, watched a lieutenant read figures to a colonel without theatre and thought, their power is not just abundance, it is accountability inside abundance. Yumi did not need the math. She tasted it in rice that arrived at the same hour every day. Murphy felt it when requisitions came back approved the first time, the signature a quick stroke rather than a negotiation. Tanaka trusted it because every schedule he announced on the truck was met until the act of telling time became an instrument of persuasion. The hospital ship offshore, USS Solace, traced the logic in white paint: beds, X-ray, blood, trained hands, capabilities afloat because factories ashore existed in the plural. A system that could place a floating hospital within sight of incoming artillery and keep it there had already answered every question about capacity. The arithmetic climbs toward a conclusion modern readers may resist. This mercy was not a deviation from American power, but a proof of it. The numbers were the intention. The intention wore boots. What looks like kindness, maternity priority on ration cards, school tents dry by noon, lamp mantles replaced before dusk, was doctrine backed by tonnage. The ledger at Camp Susupe, 10 to 15 births a day in the wake of a battle, was not a miracle. It was a schedule protected by Marines and supplied by factories. The Okinawa logs, approximately 196,000 civilians brought under control and care by late June, were not charity. They were stability purchased wholesale so airfields could rise and fleets could pivot. At evening, the camp smelled of coffee, DDT, and damp wool. The captain sharpened his pencil and wrote tomorrow's schedule under today's results. Murphy washed to the elbows and set clamps to dry on a towel that had once been an engineer's flag. Saito's pencil rested on a sentence he could finally finish. A nation able to make war and keep clinic hours at the same time will not be beaten by men who can do only one of those things. The lantern hissed into its appointed silence. The generator hummed its fat, contented note. The arithmetic did not need applause. It needed fuel, hands, and belief, and it had all three. The caves had taught their own catechism. Surrender is dishonor. Americans are monsters. A good death is better than capture. The camps taught counters in patient, verifiable syllables. The PA truck did not argue. It informed. Clinic opens 8. Mothers first. Names posted. Water safe when green flag flies. Rice at noon, blankets at dusk. After a week of being right at small things, the loudspeaker could risk larger truths. Your cousin Takao is here. He works on the latrine detail. He is alive. He can meet you at the gate at 9. A woman stepped out of rocks and into rain because a clock had made her brave. Surrenders began to tick upward, not by drama, but by rhythm. The civil affairs captain pinned a chart inside the command tent that looked like weather rising. Cave groups contacted per day, surrenders per block, clinic throughput, latrine compliance. The column labelled Rumour Disproved got its own pencil at last. Tanaka trained 2 more interpreters to read the schedule like scripture: exact times, repeat thrice, name witnesses, name locations, repeat. He took no pleasure in watching propaganda starve. He took pride in truth that fed people. At the perimeter wire, Saito listened to the names being read with that distinctive courtesy Nisei soldiers carried like a trademark. He no longer resented the fact that the sentences took their time. He recognized a method that disciplined rage into usefulness. A school tent opened at Awase, with mats dry as bread, and a chalkboard that would have looked at home in any village from Kagoshima to Aomori. Children traced kana with charcoal and learned 2 new words whose pairing felt like witchcraft. Clinic hours. A mother came to the rope for water and found her sister already in line with a ration card. The reunion did more to empty a cave than a company of riflemen ever had. Numbers followed. A squad kept quiet because their families had names on a ledger inside. A hillside surrendered because last night's radio said 3 mothers delivered by lantern and no one died. The airfield schedule crept forward. A bulldozer operator wrote 2 days ahead in grease pencil on the cowl. A colonel, suspicious by habit, had his. Aide cross-checked the surrender rate against the leaflet drop schedule, the PA truck's route, and the clinic's posted hours. The correlation line leaned the right way. He nodded once and released another day's gasoline for the trucks that moved words. The 10th Army's guns did not stop. They spoke at ridges that refused reason, and the shells walked those hills in the dumb persuasion only explosives can deliver. Yet even the gun line benefited from the ledger. Fewer holdouts meant fewer night raids, fewer gaps in wire, fewer flares at 3 a.m., fewer exhausted sergeants making mistakes at dawn. The mercy margin, paid for by factories and guarded by rifles, returned compound interest to men who would never meet the babies it protected. Yumi did not know the graphs on the captain's table, but she recognized their shadow on the ground. The line at the water point grew shorter by inches each day. The ration clerk's voice softened. The nurse's hands slowed from frantic to diligent. Sachi learned to sleep through the generator's contented hum and startle only at thunder. In the pen, Saito scratched out the last fragments of a code that had anchored him. Death before capture. He had not defected to comfort. He had capitulated to fact. It helped that facts arrived on time. He watched a woman step out of a cave with a white flag made from the lining of a coat and a baby tucked inside like contraband, and he felt the old shame try to rise. Then he watched a corpsman tuck a blanket around the pair, and the shame, for once, had the decency to sit down and keep quiet. By evening the camp smelled of rice and rain. The chaplain read a psalm over a stillborn with a Shinto prayer learned the week before. The ledger took both with the same hand. The loudspeaker named tomorrow's clinic hours and then turned off, and for a few breaths the island heard itself. Water, wind, someone laughing near the school tent, the far, blunt punctuation of guns. The collapse of an idea is rarely a crash. It is a settling. Rocks return to being rocks. Mothers claim their place in line. Men who once shouted instructions to death learn to prefer schedules. The night moved across the camp like a patient inspection. It found things in order. At the end, they boxed the ledger as if it were fragile glass. Pages soft from humidity, corners dog-eared, lines precise. The book smelled of pencil, phenol, and the human musk of tents. Beside it lay another ledger with a different grammar, casualty lists from Saipan and Okinawa, names in black stacked into a sobering geometry. Between them ran a bridge built from decisions taken at speed and kept by habit. Mothers first. Truth repeated, schedules kept like oaths, mercy scaled until it looked like infrastructure. Murphy signed his last requisition, clamps, gauze, lamp mantles, morphine syrettes, and tucked a copy into his sea bag next to the letter he had written to himself on a night when the generator died and a lantern refused to. He did not romanticize what he had seen. He catalogued it like a man who knows a good tool by weight. Tanaka put his microphone into a wooden crate and taped the lid with more reverence than he would have used on a rifle. He slid the ledger in after it and wrote 2 lines on the box in English and Japanese. Names keep their power. In a different tent, a civil affairs officer typed a summary that would read cold unless you knew how to warm it with memory. Approximately 196,000 civilians controlled and cared for by late June. Clinic throughput stabilized, sanitation compliance high, school tents opened at Aways and Koza, notable decrease in holdout incidents within PA coverage areas. He did not add the line he believed most. Mercy, delivered on time, shortens wars. Offshore, USS Solace, AH-5 sounded her whistle, then turned her white hull toward the next wound. On a workbench, a Seabee wiped his crowbar with an oily rag, a ritual that declared the day worth it. A ration clerk hung his scale on a nail, and by reflex steadied it until it stopped trembling. Yumi held Sachi, now rounder and louder, and named the future with the caution people use after surviving surprise. Tomorrow we will stand in line. Tomorrow I will learn a new word. Tomorrow the rain will come or it won't. Tomorrow there will be rice. Saito watched the camp from the gate where he had signed his name and then written it again in a hand that looked like someone else's. He did not pretend to understand the country that had beaten his. He knew only that its power consisted not just of ships and guns and planes, though the 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone felt like a storm no wall could hold, but of schedules kept with the same stubbornness as firing tables. He saw that a system capable of spending over 1.1 million 105mm shells on an island and still running a maternity ward every day could not be beaten by an army that had to choose one or the other. The last convoy rolled out, Duke AWs waddling toward the shore with that ungainly grace that had become a kind of poetry. LVT-4S clattered with their ramps up, steel bellies empty for once. The camp breathed and waited, and then, with the ordinary sadness of endings, began to come down. Ropes slackened, stakes pulled, chalkboards wiped, latrine pits filled and flagged. The school tent came last, because you do not close a classroom before you must. A child drew a duck on the board, stub of charcoal squeaking, and a Seabee laughed into his sleeve because the picture looked more like a DUKW than anything that quacked. At sunset, the captain stood where the gate had been and said thank you to no one in particular. The island smelled of rain and exhaust, rice and disinfectant, machine oil and faintly the sweetness of powdered milk. The ledger sat in its crate, quiet as a vow. The historian will be tempted to lead with the spectacular. The cliffs at Marpy Point, the nights the sky fell in steel, the statistics that look like misprints. Lead instead with a kettle rattling on a burner and a nurse saying, breathe. Put the numbers beside the breath, names logged, babies weighed, factories counted, and see how they rhyme. America's advantage was not only quantity but character, the will to make abundance behave, to teach it to show up on time with blankets as readily as with shells. The legacy is measurable, pacification faster, airfields sooner, fewer men dead on ridges they never had to climb. It is also something that refuses to be graphed, a woman naming her daughter Sachi, a prisoner finishing a sentence without crossing it out, a corpsman who still hears a lantern hiss when he closes his eyes. The crate thumped into a truck bed. The road turned to the sea. The book rode toward a future that would call it unbelievable. The pages did not mind. They had been written in weather.